In 1817, in Red River, Tennessee, John Bell stepped onto his porch, the evening air thick with unease. A shadow moved at the edge of his farm, shifting, watching. That night, the knocking began. On the walls, doors, the windows. Then came the whispers. A voice, cold and mocking, called his name. His family would soon discover they were not alone, and they would never know peace again. The Bell Witch was here, and she had only just begun. This isn't just any old ghost story. This is the true nightmare of the Bell Witch haunting. The nightmare began in 1817, when John Bell first laid eyes on something unearthly. A twisted creature lurking in the shadows, its body like a hound's, yet its head, disturbingly, that of a rabbit. He raised his gun and fired, but the thing simply vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Not long after, his son, Drew, encountered an enormous bird, perched unnervingly still on a fence post, its eyes gleaming before it took flight, far larger than any bird should be. Meanwhile, young Betsy Bell glimpsed something even more chilling. A ghostly girl in a tattered green dress, silently swaying from the limb of an oak tree, as if she had been left there to rot. Their slave, Dean, was plagued by a different horror. Night after night, a hulking black dog with glowing eyes trailed him through the darkness as he made his way to see his wife. And then, whatever it was, crept closer. The Bell house itself became a vessel for the unknown. Knocks echoed through the halls, first soft, then relentless, pounding from doors and walls without source. The gnashing of unseen teeth gnawed at the bedposts. The growls of invisible beasts erupted into vicious battles, and the dragging of chains scraped endlessly along the wooden floorboards. As the terror grew, John Bell himself began to change. His mouth twisted into unnatural stillness, robbed of movement, as if unseen hands gripped him in his sleep. The nights became worse. Sheets were torn from the children as they slept, leaving them shivering and exposed to the cold. Unseen forces lurking in the dark. Then it grew cruel. It yanked at their hair, scratched their skin until it bled, and for poor Betsy, the torment was the worst. The unseen hands pinched her flesh, struck her in the face, and plunged pins deep into her skin. The Bell family was no longer haunted. They were hunted. Desperate and shaken, the Bells turned to their trusted friend, James Johnston, pleading for help. He agreed to stay the night in their accursed home, but when the darkness fell, it found him too. The same eerie knocks, the same unseen claws scraping and gnawing in the shadows. Then came the whispers, low, taunting, seeping from the walls like something watching, waiting. When morning finally came, Johnston, pale and grim, looked John Bell in the eye and uttered a chilling truth. It's a spirit, just like in the Bible. The horror could not be contained. The tale of the Bell Witch spread like sickness, drawing the curious and the fearful from miles away, all desperate to glimpse the nightmare for themselves. And then it spoke. A disembodied voice, thin and cracked like dry leaves rustling in the wind, whispered from the void. When asked, "Who are you? What do you want?" the answer came, feeble, yet laced with sorrow. "I am a spirit. I was once very happy, but I have been disturbed." But the spirit was no simple ghost. It wove conflicting stories of its origins, some claiming it had risen from a desecrated Native American burial mound on the Bell's land. Others hinted at buried treasures long lost to the earth, sending Drew Bell and Bennett Porter on a wild, hopeless search through the dirt, as if the entity delighted in their futility. Then the voice grew stronger. It no longer whispered. It conversed. It echoed the words of two sermons preached miles apart, repeating them perfectly, as if it had been in both places at once. It spoke of Scripture with unsettling familiarity, engaging in endless religious debates, twisting faith into something cold and mocking. But most chilling of all was its taste for gossip. The spirit knew secrets from homes miles away, whispering of private sins, muttering about betrayals behind closed doors, and sometimes when asked too many questions, it would simply disappear, only to return moments later, laughing, mocking. It had been visiting. John Johnston, son of James, sought to test the entity, to see if it truly was all-knowing. He posed a question no outsider could possibly answer, asking what his Dutch step-grandmother in North Carolina would say to the slaves when she suspected them of wrongdoing. The air grew heavy, and then from the darkness, a voice rang out. It was her voice, thick with her accent. It chided, "Hut tut, what has happened now?" The blood drained from John's face. The thing knew. Another traveller, an Englishman, stopped by, intrigued by the chilling rumours. A skeptic, he offered to investigate, confident he would uncover a hoax. But when he spoke of his family overseas, the witch latched onto his words like a leech. Then, to his horror, it began to mimic them, perfectly, cruelly, repeating phrases in the voices of his mother and father, voices that should have been an ocean away. That very night, the spirit came to him again, rousing him from sleep with a sickening revelation. His parents, thousands of miles across the sea, had just heard his voice in their home. Shaken and pale, the Englishman fled at dawn. Days later, a letter arrived for the Bells, his trembling apology scrawled across the page. He had doubted, he had questioned, but now he knew the truth. The thing in their home was no simple spirit. It was everywhere, and yet, for all its cruelty, the entity was not without favouritism. It seemed to possess a strange, unsettling fondness for Lucy Bell, John's wife. It called her the most perfect woman to walk the earth, and when the mood struck, it would leave fresh fruit for her, its unseen hands offering gifts like a suitor in the dark. It would sing to her, soft, eerie hymns that drifted through the house in the dead of night, wrapping around her like a lullaby. And John Bell Jr., though not spared entirely, was shown a rare kind of respect. But kindness from something so unnatural was not a comfort. This was a warning. The entity had a name for John Bell Sr., Old Jack, and it spat it with venom, delighting in his torment. It made no secret of its purpose. "I will kill you," it whispered from the shadows, its voice curling around him like smoke. It cursed him, tormented him, and wore him down piece by piece. His body withered under its unseen hand, sickness creeping through his veins like poison long before the final blow. And then the nightmare reached its crescendo. One morning, Old Jack was found lifeless, his body stiff, his lips stained with something vile. Beside him, a mysterious vial sat, its contents dark and unknown. Someone, something, had poured death down his throat. The family gathered, grief-stricken, but it was not done. As they mourned, as they wept, the silence of the funeral was shattered. The entity sang. Not hymns, not lamentations, drinking songs. It cackled as it filled the room with a mocking melody, its voice twisted with glee, turning their sorrow into its amusement. The Bell Witch had won. But it was not finished. In 1821, Betsy Bell, crushed under the weight of unseen horrors, abandoned her engagement to Joshua Gardner, just as the entity had wanted. The voice, always watching, always waiting, had whispered its satisfaction. And then, as suddenly as it had come, it declared it would leave. But not forever. "I will return in 7 years." And so it did. In 1828, right on time, the entity returned, slipping through the veil once more. Lucy Bell and her sons, Richard and Joel, braced themselves as the same unnatural disturbances resumed. But this time, they did not respond. They did not plead, did not scream. They ignored the thing that hung in the air around them, refusing to give it power. And then, without fanfare, without farewell, it vanished. But silence does not mean absence. Some say it never truly left. It only waits. Even war-hardened men were not immune to the terror of the Bell Witch. It is said that none other than Andrew Jackson himself, drawn by the sinister legend, set out with his men to confront the entity. But the darkness that hung over the Bell family was no mere superstition. The men, once fearless soldiers, found themselves overwhelmed by an unseen force, their courage drained, their resolve shattered. They fled. Whatever lurked at the Bell farm was beyond the reach of steel and gunpowder. But the origin of the entity was a riddle wrapped in blood and shadow. Some whispered that it was not born from the disturbed dead, but from murder. An old tale from Panola County, Mississippi, spoke of a cruel overseer, one John Bell had supposedly killed in North Carolina. And if this version of the story is to be believed, death did not end his wrath. The spirit returned, but something about it had changed. It no longer sought only vengeance, it sought love. Fixated on a young woman named Mary, an obsession that sealed her doom. The entity's unnatural desire for her was as restless as it was horrifying, and in the end, Mary did not escape its grasp. She succumbed, not to blades, not to poison, but to it. A fate eerily reminiscent of the old vampire legends, where the line between love and possession was drawn in blood. Some have tried to explain the Bell Witch's power, but its abilities remain beyond human understanding. Scholars have likened it to the ancient jinn of mythology, beings of fire and shadow, neither ghost nor demon, yet capable of twisting reality itself. Richard Williams Bell, in his aged manuscript, offered no answers, only fear. The spirit, he wrote, remained a mystery. Whether it was witchery, such as afflicted people in past centuries and the darker ages, whether some gifted fiend of hellish nature, practicing sorcery for selfish enjoyment, or some more modern science akin to that of mesmerism, or some hobgoblin native to the wilds of the country, or a disembodied soul shut out from heaven, or an evil spirit like those Paul drove out of the man into the swine, setting them mad, or a demon let loose from hell. I am unable to decide, nor has anyone yet divined its nature or cause for appearing, and I trust this description of the monster in all forms and shapes, and of many tongues, will lead experts who may come with a wiser generation to a correct conclusion and satisfactory explanation. In 1820, military officer John R. Bell set out with Stephen Harriman Long on a treacherous expedition across the Great Plains. As supplies dwindled, the party split, with Bell and Long taking separate paths through the unforgiving terrain, only to reunite at Fort Smith, Arkansas. Throughout the journey, Bell kept a meticulous journal, documenting every hardship, every strange encounter. But nothing he had seen before could prepare him for what awaited on his return. On October 19th, 1820, as he travelled back east, Bell crossed the Red River at Port Royal, Tennessee. That very evening, weary and dust-covered, he stopped at the Murphy residence in Robertson County for a humble meal. But the conversation at the table was anything but ordinary. The family spoke of a young woman, one not alone. Wherever she went, a voice followed, speaking from the air itself, disembodied, yet all too real. It was not a whisper in her mind, not a trick of the wind. It had intentions. It wanted to marry a certain man. And the strangest part, thousands had come, drawn by curiosity and fear, just to hear it. Bell, a man of reason, recorded the tale in his journal, pressing ink to paper in the dim candlelight. But long after he left that house, long after the dust of Tennessee settled behind him, the story remained. It resurfaced centuries later, unearthed by historian David Britton and presented to the world in a chilling Discovery Channel broadcast in November 2020. The connection was unmistakable. The voice that haunted that young woman was no simple ghost. It was her, the Bell Witch. Ingram appended a date of 1875 or 1876 to the bloodshed, but connected the Rawls' recollection with the death of Smith. Smith came into the community a stranger, and was employed by Mr. Fletcher, where Clinard and Burgess were also engaged on the farm. Smith professed to be something of a wizard, or rather boasted of his power to hypnotise and lay spells on people, subjecting anyone who came under his influence to his will. and it was reported that he claimed to have derived this power from the mantle of the Bell Witch. However, the writer interviewed John F. House, who was counsel for the defence on the subject, who says that no such evidence was produced in the trial, but that the lawyers handled the Bell Witch affair for all that it was worth in the defence of their clients, presenting the analogy or similarity of circumstances with good effect on the jury. On the night of April 24th, 1880, a sinister disturbance gripped a small home in Springfield, Tennessee. It began as a series of slow, deliberate knocks, resonating from beneath the floorboards, as if something unseen lurked just beneath the surface. The eerie pounding continued relentlessly from 10:30 p.m. until the cold, dead hours of 4 a.m., while a group of 10 to 12 determined souls gathered outside, desperately searching for the source. But the sound had no origin, and it had no intention of stopping. By April 26th, word had spread like wildfire. Hundreds of curious onlookers descended upon the home, eager to glimpse the unexplained horror for themselves. They camped outside in droves, defying the homeowner's pleas to leave, and then, on the night of April 28th, the family, driven to the edge of terror, abandoned the house entirely. That night, a smaller group of investigators remained, braving the darkness, listening, waiting. Then, from 50 yards away, the knocking began again. Deep, hollow, impossible. Whatever had plagued the home was no longer bound by walls. It had followed them into the night. The journalist who recorded these events couldn't ignore the chilling echoes of another tale, one whispered for generations. A tale of an entity that tormented and destroyed. A tale of the Bell Witch. It is an actual fact that several hundred intelligent people of Springfield and vicinity have been so excited over the noise as to go night after night to listen to it. About 30 years ago, Robertson County had a sensation similar to this known as the Bell Witch, and people came from all parts of the country, even as far as New York, to hear or see her. In the spring of 1880, the home of Dr. John W. Nuckols, a respected physician, became the epicenter of an unexplainable terror. Night after night, a phantom knocking echoed beneath the floorboards, shaking the very foundation of his home. But this was no ordinary haunting. It was a disturbance that would unravel lives. Dr. Nuckols had recently married Laura Hopkins Jones, a union tainted by her family's disapproval. As the knocks persisted, suspicion crept into their marriage like a slow poison. A local carpenter, Jill Walling, accused Laura of harbouring a sinister trick. A hidden iron ball suspended by a rubber belt, tapping out its eerie rhythm beneath her skirts. But even as the whispers grew louder, nobody could ever prove it. By May, the tension became unbearable, and the couple separated. Then came August. One night, driven by desperation, John Nuckols snatched his infant child from Laura's arms and fled through the darkened streets, his estranged wife chasing after him in a fit of anguish. The town watched in silence, the echoes of their fractured love story blending with the whispers of the supernatural. The child was eventually returned to Laura, who sought refuge in her father's home. In February of 1882, John Nuckols confronted his father-in-law, Asa Hopkins, demanding to see his child. The argument turned venomous, voices rising like a storm. A witness later claimed the very subject of ghosts had surfaced between them, before Nuckols, eyes wild with fury, reached for his weapon, ready to spill blood. He was restrained, but the confrontation had awakened something far more dangerous. The very next day, vengeance arrived. Laura's brother, S.B. Hopkins, travelled from Nashville with a double-barreled shotgun. Without hesitation, he fired. Dr. John W. Knuckles collapsed, his life spilling out onto the cold ground. Some called it justice. Others called it murder. The court would ultimately set Hopkins free. Yet, in the wake of these events, the whispers never ceased. Some say it was madness. Others believe it was something far worse, something unseen, manipulating the fate of those who dared to disturb it. Something that had haunted Tennessee before, something that never truly left. In the fading glow of Nashville's Centennial Exposition in 1880, an ominous account was penned. A several-page record of the Bell Witch legend, hidden within a sketch of Robertson County. The identity of its author remains a mystery. The article undated, its origins as shadowy as the entity it describes. Published in 1900 by the Tennessee Historical Society, this chilling narrative ends abruptly at the year 1880, as if the writer dared not to follow the story any further. The sources were many. F. R. Miles, William Pride, W. J. Gooch, Ben B. Batts, and others whose voices have long since faded. But the tale they passed down was all too real. The disturbance, they said, began with a burial desecration. Skull bones, unearthed from a nearby mound along the river bluff, were returned in a desperate attempt to quell the spirit's wrath. But the witch was not so easily appeased. It spoke in tongues, many tongues. Its voice slithered through the darkness, mocking, taunting. It had power over the animals, setting hounds upon unsuspecting souls as if the creatures themselves were under its control. And though the Centennial account does not name the witch as John Bell's murderer, the silence on the matter is deafening. Some things, perhaps, were too terrifying to be written down. At one time, a vial of poison was found in the flue of the chimney, and being taken down, Dr. George B. Hobson gave one drop to a cat, causing its death in 7 seconds. The witch claimed to have put the poison there for the purpose of killing Mr. Bell. Being asked how it was going to administer the poison, it said by pouring it into the dinner pot. It is remarkable that although he enjoyed good health up to the time of this event, Mr. Bell died within days after the vial was found, being in a stupor at the time of his death. From this time, the people visited the house less frequently, although the witch would now and then be heard. In Richard Williams Bell's harrowing account, his father, John Bell, had already been wasting away, his body failing, his strength fading. He lay bedridden, gripped by an unknown affliction. When the house fell into dreadful silence, then came the moment of horror. John Bell Sr., searching for answers, opened a cupboard and found a small, sinister vial. Its contents were a mystery, but its purpose soon became terrifyingly clear. As the family scrambled for help, summoning Dr. Hobson, the Bell Witch's voice erupted through the room, laughing, triumphant. "I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, and it fixed him." Sick with dread, Alex Gunn and John Bell Jr. tested the vial's contents on a cat, dripping the liquid onto its tongue with a straw. The animal convulsed violently, then dropped dead. The poison was real, and it had done its work. The next day, December 20th, 1820, John Bell was gone. But The Witch was not finished. A centennial sketch described its terrifying abilities, an entity that could shift its form at will, appearing as a rabbit, a bear, a massive black dog. It mimicked the sound of beasts, its voice slithering from the darkness, always listening, always watching. It called itself many things: Three Waters, Pineapple, Black Dog, but it was never alone. For a time, the Bell home played host to an entire family of spirits, their presence fleeting but deeply unsettling. Their names were whispered like a cursed chant: Black Dog, Mathematics, Jerusalem. Of them all, Black Dog was the one the others followed, the leader, the one very much in control. The Bell Witch was never just one voice. It was many, and it had no intention of leaving. Goodspeed Brothers' 1886 History of Tennessee recorded a short account of the legend that identified the spirit of female and stated that interest in the phenomenon was widespread in the region at the time. A remarkable occurrence, which attracted widespread interest, was connected with the family of John Bell, who settled near what is now Adams Station about 1804. So great was the excitement that people came from hundreds of miles around to witness the manifestations of what was popularly known as the Bell Witch. This witch was supposed to be some spiritual being having the voice and attributes of a woman. It was invisible to the eye, yet it would hold conversation and even shake hands with certain individuals. The freaks it performed were wonderful and seemingly designed to annoy the family. It would take sugar from the bowls, spill the milk, take the quilts from the beds, slap and pinch the children, and then laugh at the discomfiture of its victims. At first, it was supposed to be a good spirit, but its subsequent acts, together with the curses with which it supplemented its remarks, proved the contrary. A volume might be written concerning the performances of this wonderful being, as they are now described by contemporaries and their descendants. That all this actually occurred will not be disputed, nor will a rational explanation be attempted. It is merely introduced as an example of superstition, strong in the minds of all but a few in those times, and not yet wholly extinct. In the dead of winter, during the week of January 20th, 1890, an unseen terror descended upon a quiet home just east of Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Word spread like wildfire. Hundreds gathered in the bitter cold, drawn by whispers of something unnatural. Coal, cold, black, and unexplainable, was falling from the ceiling, raining down upon the family room without warning, without reason. The house belonged to Reverend W.G.L. Quate, a respected minister of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. He lived there with his wife, his stepdaughter Belle Hall, and a young servant girl of just 16. But the walls of their home no longer offered shelter. Something had crept in, unseen and malicious. One night, as Mrs. Quate moved through the room, a jagged chunk of coal came hurtling from above, striking her squarely on the head. Blood followed. She collapsed on the floor, dazed, as a physician was called to tend her wounds. The air inside the house grew thick with dread. Some looked to logic, whispering that the young servant girl might be to blame, but others, those who knew the old stories, spoke of something darker. The Bell Witch had haunted Robertson County before, tormenting, stalking, killing. Had she returned? By the week's end, the coal fall had lessened, but the fear very much remained. Each night, as the house lay shrouded in uneasy silence, Reverend Quate knelt in prayer, seeking divine protection against whatever force lurked in the shadows. But the question remained, was it ever truly gone? Or was it waiting, watching, ready to strike again? On the evening of January 27th, 1890, as the last traces of daylight faded over Adams Station, Tennessee, Mr. Holloway was tending to his cattle when he saw them, two strange women, silent and motionless, watching him from the edge of his property. He turned away for only a moment, just long enough to finish his task. But when he looked back, the women were gone. Their horses, too, had vanished without a sound. Inside the house, his wife stood pale and stiff, her hands trembling at her sides. She had seen them, too, standing in the yard, staring towards the house. But they hadn't knocked, they hadn't spoken, and now they were nowhere to be found. Later that week, Mr. Rowland struggled against something unseen. He tried again and again to load a sack of corn onto his horse's back, but each time it fell as if some invisible hands had ripped it away. Frustrated, he called for Joe Johnson, who came to steady the sack. Together, they tried once more. But as soon as Mr. Rowland mounted his horse, the sack wrenched itself free. The two men watched, frozen in horror, as it lifted from the ground, twisting and drifting unnaturally through the air. It floated untouched 20 yards across the yard before settling at the fence line. Gathering their courage, they stepped forward to retrieve it, but before their hands could reach, the night itself seemed to exhale, carrying a voice from nowhere and everywhere at once. You won't touch this sack any more. The air grew heavy. The silence that followed was deafening. Neither man dared move. The stories spread like a sickness, whispers crawling through the town of Adams Station. The thing, the witch, had made itself known once more. Mr. Johnson had been visiting Buck Smith, speaking in hushed tones about the ghostly presence that had haunted his home. As they spoke, a knock rattled the door, but when they opened it, there was nothing. Then, another knock, this time from the opposite side of the house. The men turned, their breath catching in their throats. They did not answer it. Instead, they sat in uneasy silence, watching the shadows stretch and flicker. Then, the dog began to growl, its fur bristling. It lunged, snarling and snapping at the empty air as if something unseen was attacking it. Before they could react, the door flew open with a force that shook the walls. A howling wind tore through the room, carrying with it a fire, a living, hungry thing that spread unnaturally fast. The men scrambled to smother the flames, but as quickly as they appeared, the coals vanished, swallowed by the wind as if they had never been there. That night, as Mr. Johnson rode home, a weight suddenly landed on the back of his horse. His breath hitched as icy fingers dug deep into his shoulder. He twisted, trying to shake it off, but there was nothing to see. Only the pressure, the grip tightening. His horse reared and bolted forward, Johnson struggling to stay in the saddle. As his house came into view, the thing released him, and he heard it rustling through the dead leaves, moving towards the trees. But the darkness swallowed whatever it was. Others had their own horrors to tell. Mr. Winters returned from hunting, his prize, a strange bird, secured in his game bag. But when he opened it, the bird was gone. In its place sat a rabbit. He barely had time to react before that too disappeared. And then there was Mr. Rowland. Late one night, as he burned brush in the field, a figure emerged from the gloom. A man, or something like one. Half clothed, its skin black as coal, and in the centre of its forehead, a single, unblinking eye. The thing spoke, its voice hollow and distant, instructing Roland to follow. Which he did. It led him to a massive rock and told him to dig. Then it vanished. He dug until his hands were raw, until exhaustion overtook him. The next morning he returned with Bill Burgess and Mr. Johnson. Together they unearthed something, a massive, overturned kettle, buried in the soil like a tombstone. But as they worked to free it, the earth rebelled. The soil churned and collapsed inward, filling the hole faster than they could dig. It was as if the ground itself refused to give up whatever lay beneath. By this time, the stories had spread. People came from miles around, drawn to the place where the witch's presence loomed. But nobody came looking for answers, only to witness. Born near Guthrie, Kentucky on June 20th, 1832, Martin Van Buren Ingram came into the world beneath a dark and restless sky. At 17, the weight of his family's land fell upon his shoulders, a burden passed down like a curse. During the Civil War, he marched with Hawkins' Nashville Battalion, only to be cast aside after the Battle of Shiloh, his body failing him in ways no surgeon could fully explain. Some said it was injury. Others whispered it was something else, that he had seen things on that battlefield, things that left scars deeper than flesh. In April 1866, with no prior experience, Ingram stepped into the world of publishing, taking control of the Robertson Register. But some claimed the words he printed were not always his own, that they were guided by unseen hands, whispers from the past, seeping into ink and paper. By October 1868, he had moved his operations to Clarksville, and in February 1869, the Clarksville Tobacco Leaf was born. But the paper carried more than just news. It carried a weight, a shadow that followed Ingram wherever he went. By 1881, his grip on the paper loosened. Poor health gnawed at him. His body was wasting away. Tragedy haunted his home. Fire licked at his livelihood. Whether it was bad luck or something far worse, no one could say. But those who read his final works swore they could still hear his voice in the dead of night, whispering, scratching, waiting. On the occasion of Ingram's death in October 1909, editor of the Clarksville Leaf Chronicle, W. W. Barksdale, wrote of his friend and colleague. We doubt exceedingly if there ever lived a man who performed as much self-sacrificing labour to further the interests of the community in which he lived. He became a citizen of Clarksville 40 years ago, and from that time particularly until the day of his death, his greatest concern was the advancement and welfare of his adopted town and county. A man of true mould, he despised all deceit, trickery and littleness, and with a courage which nothing could daunt, he laid on the journalistic lash unsparingly whenever he thought the occasion required. Naturally, his was not a pathway strewn with roses. His was an aggressive nature, a fact which often brought him into serious collision with those with whom he took issue. Time, however, usually justified him in the positions which he assumed. By May of 1903, a dark whisper spread through Tennessee, a prophecy that the witch would return. The centennial of the Bell family's arrival loomed near, and with it the shadow of something long buried but never truly gone. In August of that year, a Memphis newspaper reignited the old terror, warning of the spirit's return. But in Springfield, the Herald dismissed the claims with cold skepticism, scoffing at the notion that anyone feared the Bell Witch. They accused the Memphis paper of plagiarism, but their defiance rang hollow. By September, the town remained untouched. No voices in the night, no phantom knocks, no unseen hands pulling at bed covers. The Bell Witch had not come. Yet. But silence does not mean safety. Decades later, in 1934, Charles Bailey Bell, a grandson of John Bell Jr. and a respected neurologist, released a book that stirred the bones of the past. The Bell Witch, a mysterious spirit, unearthed stories long whispered in his family, tales passed to him by his great-aunt Betsy in her final years. Among them was another account of Andrew Jackson's cursed visit, where even the hardened general was forced to admit that something beyond reason lurked in the Bell home. But worse still was the tale of the boy trapped in the Bell Witch cave, screaming as unseen hands gripped his legs and dragged him deeper into the darkness, only to be wrenched back out, feet first, by something that left no footprints in the dirt. And then there were the prophecies. Bell claimed that in 1828, the entity whispered secrets to his ancestors, visions of blood, ruin, and fate. Among them, one warning stood out, a date etched in dread. The witch would return in 1935. 107 years after her last visit, the year came. The air grew heavy. The wind carried voices. But was she ever truly gone? In 1937, the whispers returned. Lewis Garrison, owner of the land that held the Bell Witch Cave, began hearing strange sounds from deep within. They started as faint murmurings, barely more than the wind through the trees. But then, scraping, shifting, the unmistakable sound of something moving where nothing should be. Bell descendants, long accustomed to the legend, began experiencing their own disturbances. They described the eerie sensation of something rubbing against the walls of their homes at night, slow and deliberate, as if unseen fingers traced the wood. A paper-like object was seen drifting through an open door, only to return through another, as if guided by an unseen hand. And then, the sound of a piano playing softly in the empty dark. It was on July 29th, 1937, that fear gripped the town once more. A group from the Epworth League gathered for a Wiener roast near the rock quarry by the Bell Witch Cave. They laughed about the old stories, mocking the legend, until the air turned still. Then, someone pointed, and the laughter died. Above them, perched on the cliff's edge, sat a woman, motionless, just watching. A chill ran through the group. Some swore they could see the outline of her dress, the hollow darkness where her eyes should be. Without waiting for more, they ran. A minister, sceptical and brave, later tried to explain it away. He told the newspaper it was just the moonlight playing tricks on a rock. But another report followed, one that buried his words in doubt. That night, the moon had barely been visible at all. The years passed, but the witch was never far away. In November 1965, an article detailed a peculiar event surrounding an antique oak rocking chair, once owned by attorney Charlie Willett, a descendant of the Bell family. The chair was sold at an estate sale to Mrs. J.C. Adams, owner of an antique store along US 41. One day, a customer, drawn to the chair, sat down and began to rock. As she swayed, she casually asked Mrs. Adams, "Do you believe in the supernatural?" 2 weeks later, the woman's daughter returned to the store. Her mother had gone to the Bell Cemetery after leaving that day, where a voice, low and commanding, whispered in her ear, "Stand up and look around. You will find something of great value." Soon after, her car stalled near an open field. With no choice but to walk, she wandered into the grass, the feeling of unseen eyes pressing against her. Then she saw it, a black iron kettle overturned in the dirt. Hesitant, she reached down and turned it over. Nestled beneath, gleaming under the fading light, was a pearl buckle. When she brought it to a jeweller, he estimated its age, 160 to 200 years old. A relic from the past, a message from the grave. And maybe, just maybe, a gift from the witch. Some say fate follows the Bell family like a shadow. Nobody knows this better than Charles Romain Willett. A son of the Bell bloodline, Willett had a sharp mind and steady hands. By 16, he was already drawn to the newspaper business, chasing truth in ink. He played professional baseball, mastered law on his own, and became the first managing editor of the Nashville Tennessean in 1907. He was a man of influence, a mayor, a legislator, a man people could trust. But there was one thing he would never do. He would never marry. He would never marry Jerry Cullum Gardner. Every Sunday without fail, he would take her for ice cream in Clarksville, then dinner at Richardson's restaurant. The town watched them, their bond undeniable, yet they never wed. Some whispered that it was out of familial obligation. Others, however, believed something darker. That they refused to tempt fate. For his bloodline belonged to the Bells, and hers belonged to the Gardners. When questioned in the early 1960s, Jerry Gardner admitted that had Charlie Willett ever asked for her hand, she would have said yes. When the words reached Charlie, he only smiled, hooked his thumbs through his suspenders, and said, "Oh, she said that, did she?" A playful remark, but those who knew the stories, the curse, the legend, the warnings from the past, knew better. In 1944, a young girl named Bonnie Hanline skipped English class to explore the Bell Witch Cave. She had done it before, borrowing a lantern from Mrs. Garrison, the landowner. The cave was dark, its tunnels winding and wet, but it had never frightened her. Until that day. Halfway inside, the flame flickered, then snuffed out. She was left in total darkness. Her hands trembled as she relit the lantern, but the moment the flame took hold, it blew out once more. Something did not want her there. Panic seized her and she dropped to the ground, crawling blindly along the water path, feeling her way towards the entrance. When she finally emerged, breathless and shaking, she saw something unusual. An open can of pork and beans, and a pack of marshmallows left in the dirt. Later that evening, she learned the truth. Two fugitives, men who had escaped from law enforcement, had been hiding in the very back of the cave. Had she gone any further, she might never have come out again. Bonnie believed the witch had saved her. In 1977, 5 soldiers from Fort Campbell visited the Bell Witch Cave. Young, strong, and fearless, they laughed at the old legend, daring the spirit to show itself. One soldier sat upon a rock, his arms crossed, smirking. "This place is nothing," he scoffed. Then something grabbed him. An invisible force wrapped around his chest, tight, unrelenting, as if unseen arms were trying to pull him into the dark. He gasped, struggling to breathe, his face draining of colour. His friends rushed forward, grabbing him, shaking him, and then, as suddenly as it came, it was gone. The air was silent. The cave, watching. None of them laughed after that. In 1986, David Jarrett, a writer for the Tennessean, and Bill Wilson, a photographer and experienced cave explorer, were given special permission to do something most would never dare: spend the night inside the Bell Witch Cave. They entered the first chamber, the walls damp with time, the air thick with silence. But that silence did not last. From deep within the cave, a sound rumbled towards them. Jared estimated it came from 30 yards away, a groan, long and unwavering. Then, as if something was stirring, came a series of heavy thumps, the sound of footsteps where no feet should be. Then, the groan returned, louder this time, closer. The men simply froze. The third time it came, they ran. They reached the entrance, trying to steady their breaths, rationalizing what they had just heard. Maybe it was the old wiring, they thought. Maybe it was the wind. Cautiously, they went back inside. As they stepped into the chamber, a low rumble filled the space. Their bodies stiffened. Something was near the entrance. Slowly they turned back. Only then did they recognize the source. It was the distant roar of a jet passing overhead. They let out nervous chuckles, shaking their heads. They had spooked themselves. Then, as they reached the gate, the cave itself screamed. A high-pitched wail ripped through the stone, piercing their ears, echoing down the tunnels. It was inhuman, filled with something ancient, filled with something that did not want them there. They didn't hesitate. They left, and they did not return. In 1987, H.C. Sanders, a local gas station owner, finally spoke of something that had haunted him for 20 years. One night, long ago, he had run out of gas near the Red River just across from the Bell Witch Cave. The road was empty, swallowed in darkness. With no other option, he began walking towards the town. Then he heard it. Soft footsteps. Something was following him. He glanced back, expecting to see a stray dog, a shadow. But it was a rabbit. It hopped along the road behind him, keeping pace. Unnerved, Sanders picked up speed. The rabbit did too. He walked faster. It kept up. He broke into a run, and so did the rabbit. Panic clawed at his chest. He sprinted for a full mile, his lungs burning, his heart pounding. Finally, exhausted, he collapsed onto a log, gasping for air. A rabbit stopped too, and then it spoke. Hell of a race we had there, wasn't it? Its voice was clear. Human. Wrong. Sanders stared frozen in horror. The rabbit watched him from the other side of the log, its dark eyes reflecting in the moonlight. And then it turned and disappeared into the trees. Sanders never walked that road alone again. The Bell Witch legend is more than just a ghost story. It's a lingering whisper in the dark, a shadow that refuses to fade. From unseen hands striking in the night to disembodied voices mocking the living. The presence in Adams, Tennessee defied explanation, and perhaps it still does. Even now, visitors to the Bell Witch Cave report chilling whispers, flickering lanterns, and something unseen watching from the depths. Was it truly a vengeful spirit, a curse on the Bell family, or something far older, something waiting? The answers remain buried in the past, but one thing is for certain: those who dare to listen never forget what they hear. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for a feast of grim and grisly content. For more creepy content just like this, click here. As always, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.